So hi, I'll discuss to you chapter 2 on the accounting equation with the subtopics importance of the accounting equation, import and illustration of the accounting equation. So our lesson objectives for this topic is to define the categories of the accounting equation and to classify economic transactions in the categories of the accounting equation. This topic is very important for us to understand the principles of debit and credit. In short, a solid understanding of how the accounting equation works or on how the accounting equation is being applied to understanding the business transactions uh, will help will help you to appreciate the principles of debit and credit, which is a requirement in journalizing, posting, and in the preparation of the uh, worksheets and financial statements. So let's have first objective number 1 to define the categories of the accounting equation. So what is accounting equation? It is a basic principle of accounting and a fundamental element of the balance sheet. Now we have this accounting equation: assets is equal to liabilities plus equity. We can derive this accounting equation uh, expressing this accounting equation. uh, Liabilities is equal to assets minus equity. We just derived the first equation: assets is equal to liabilities plus equity. And then we equate liabilities to assets minus equity, or liabilities is equal to assets minus equity. And we can also express equity as the difference in the assets and the liabilities. Please remember this accounting equation and its derivation. So let us define first uh, the categories of the accounting equation. First, we have the assets. Assets is equal to liabilities less equity. So what is an asset, or what are assets? These are resources controlled by the entity as a result of past events and from which future economic benefits are expected to flow to the entity. That is according to the IASB Framework. I, I, I believe we already discussed the definition of asset in the first lecture. But I mean, reiterating the definition in this lecture will help us understand the accounting equation. So asset can be classified into two: current asset and non-current asset. Example of assets are cash, accounts receivable, notes receivable, interest receivable, equipment, building, land, accumulated depreciation, inventory, supplies, furniture and fixtures, and prepaid expenses. Another category of the accounting equation is liabilities. So this refers to financial obligations of an entity that result in the entity's future sacrifices of economic benefits to other entities. We can classify liability into two, or liabilities into two: current liability and non-current liability. Examples of liabilities are accounts payable, notes payable, interest payable, tax payable, salary payable, bank account overdraft, accrued expenses, short-term loans. Third category of the accounting equation is equity. It's the net amount of funds invested in a business by its owners plus any retained earnings. Example, shareholders' equity. We have common stock, preferred stock, contributed surplus, additional paid in capital, retained earnings, treasury stock. Let's have objective number 2. Let us classify economic transactions in the categories of the accounting equation. So let's have transaction 1. So Mr. Wright started his business by investing 200,000 pesos. Now, which of the three categories will be affected by this transaction? Or which of these three categories in the accounting equation is directly affected by this transaction? So these are assets and equity. So asset category is directly affected by this transaction, and also equity category. So for assets, there is an increase in the assets in the form of in the form of cash. Cash here, cash and this transaction is equal to 200,000 pesos. And that 200,000 pesos is also the equity of the business. So there is an increase in the equity in the form of owner's equity or a sole proprietorship equity. So the equation is still true. Ibig sabihin nun, balance pa din yung equation natin, di ba? May increase sa assets. So para maging balance siya, kailangang merong mag-increase din sa right-hand side of the equation. And it's equity because transaction 1 refers to the investing of capital or the forming of capital. Let's have transaction number 2. Mr. Wright purchased office supplies in cash amounting to 15,000 pesos. So bumili si Mr. Wright, nag-purchase siya ng office supplies in cash. Ibig sabihin merong value parted with, and that is cash. And the value received is office supplies. So alin sa tatlong category ng accounting equation yung directly affected? Only assets. Bakit assets lang? Ang na-purchase is office supplies, and office supplies is under asset. Office supplies are under assets. That's the value received. So there is an increase in the quantity and value of office supplies. And what is the value parted with? Cash. There is a decrease in cash, and cash is an asset. Meaning sa tatlong category sa accounting equation, only asset is affected. So there is a decrease in assets in the form of cash, but there is an increase in the asset in the form of office supplies. So the accounting equation is still true. What I mean is balance pa din yung accounting equation natin. Kasi accounting equation, it's an equation meaning the two sides of the equation are equal. So in transaction number 2, merong nabawas, tsaka meron ding nadagdag. So equal pa din yung dalawang sides ng equation. Let's have transaction number 3. Mr. Wright purchased additional office supplies from Star Marketing on credit amounting to 25,000 pesos. Now, alin kaya dito yung directly affected ng transaction na to? First, understand the transaction. So what's the value received? It's office supplies. And office supplies is an asset. So there is an increase in the asset. And what's the value parted with? Remember that the purchase of this additional office supplies is made on credit. Credit. Okay? So the value parted with is an obligation. It's a debt. So these two categories are directly affected by this transaction. There is an increase in asset in the form of office supplies. And there is an increase in the liabilities in the form of account payable. Now, in transaction number 3, it is stated na walang pinirmahan, walang promissory note. Therefore, it's an open account. So we use account payable. Unless otherwise, it's a note payable. So the accounting equation is still true. Kasi nag-increase yung left hand side of the equation at saka nag-increase din yung isang category sa right hand side of the equation. Let's have transaction 4. Mr. Wright paid Star Marketing in full cash. So anong transaction yun? Yung nag-purchase si Mr. Wright ng additional office supplies on credit. Nasa, ayan, transaction number 3. Okay. So, alin sa mga categories ang directly affected? First, what's the value received? Ano yung na-receive? What's the value received here? Bumaba yung obligation. No, not just bumaba, but na-close na yung account. Anong account yung na-close? Yung account payable. Kasi in transaction number 4, nagbayad na si Mr. Wright in full cash. So wala na siyang obligation. Therefore, that account payable is now a closed account. And that's the value received. That is under liability. So the liability will decrease. So if the liability will decrease, the asset must also decrease. And that is in the form of cash. Kasi yung pinambayad is cash. So the value parted with is cash. And cash is a form of an asset. So there is a decrease in cash, or there is a decrease in the asset in the form of cash, and there is a decrease in the liability in the form of account payable. So the accounting equation is still preserved, or the accounting equation is still true. Transaction number 5. Mr. Wright withdrew 30,000 pesos for personal use. Now, saan sa mga categories na to ang directly affected? What's the value received? What's the value received here? So the value received is cash. Kasi natanggap ni Mr. Wright yung cash na 30,000 pesos. Nag-withdraw siya, so that's the value received. But although it's a value received, It's a decrease in the asset in the form of cash. So, special to transaction number 5. Ito yung first transaction natin na kung saan yung value received ay naka-decrease. Okay? And what's the value parted with? The value parted with is capital. Why capital? Kasi this is a personal, this is an owner's withdrawal. This is an owner's withdrawal and that is to be deducted in the equity, in the owner's equity. So there is a decrease in the equity. So for asset, there is a decrease in cash. And in equity, there is a decrease in the owner's capital, and that is in the form of owner's drawing or withdrawal. In accounting, the usual term for this withdrawal is owner's withdrawal is owner's drawing. So the accounting equation is still preserved. Let's have transaction number 6. Mr. Wright paid the salaries of the employees. So what's the value? What's the value received? What's the value received here? And what's the value parted with? So the categories assets and equity are directly affected by this transaction. There is a decrease in the assets in the form of cash, and there is a decrease in the equity in the form of salary expense. So the accounting equation is still preserved. So in this transaction number 6, the salaries of the employees is not to be classified under liabilities. Why? Because it's the salaries were already paid. Bayad na. Nabayaran na or napasahod na yung mga employees. Therefore, this is an expense. It's a deduction. It's a decrease in the equity. Kung hindi pa nababaya, that is under liabilities and that will be termed as salary payable. This is transaction number 7. Yeah, transaction number 7. Forgot to edit. Mr. Wright purchased equipment from Anli Rice Hardware in notes. So what's the value received? Equipment. And what's the value parted with? Obligation. And take note, there is a promissory note involved here. Therefore, note, it's a note payable. So assets and liabilities are directly affected by this transaction. There is an increase in assets in the form of equipment, and there is an increase in the liabilities in the form of note payable. This is transaction number 8. Mr. Wright paid the rent for office space. So ano yung directly affected ng transaction na to? It's the assets and equity. There is a decrease in the assets in the form of cash, and there is a decrease in the equity in the form of rental expense. Now, for your first activity, you are to answer these items. There are 10 items. Susulat nyo lang sa paper. Pwedeng intermediate, yellow pad, or sa band paper. So the instruction is, you copy first, you copy the transaction, and then in every transaction, you indicate the accounting equation and what categories of the accounting equation are directly affected by the transaction. Kumbaga, do the same yung na-present ko sa mga examples kanina. You draw an arrow reflecting na nag-increase or nag-decrease yung category. So for example, in item 1, Attorney G. Concepcion began the practice of law by investing 20,000 pesos in cash on a law library of 30,000 pesos. So you choose one from these choices or from these options, and then you illustrate, same nung pagka-illustrate kanina sa mga examples. If your answer is A, there is an increase in assets and there is an increase in proprietorship, then illustrate your choice. Or provide an illustration to back up your choice. If your choice is letter B, there is an increase in liabilities and there is also an increase in proprietorship, then back up your answer with illustration. Same if your answer is letter C. For number 2, you have this: pay the monthly rental of the office space worth 2,000 pesos. Which of these three choices is correct? Again, provide illustration to back up your answer. Then for item 3, you have purchased office equipment worth 5,000 pesos and office supplies worth 1,000 pesos for cash. Same thing to do. Then item 4, completed legal work for Cuneta and collected 4,000 pesos cash. Choose one from the choices. Item 5, purchased additional office equipment from M. Soriano on credit worth 5,500 pesos. Item 6, pay the semi-monthly salary of the office secretary 3,250 pesos. Item 7, completed legal work for J.D. Belen on credit worth 1,500 pesos. For item 8, paid one-half of the amount due to M. Soriano. Item 9, D. Belen paid her account in full. And item 10, withdrew 1,000 pesos for personal use. So again, the instruction is on a sheet of paper, you write your complete name, your course and year, our subject, and then you indicate quiz number 1, and then copy or write first the transaction, write all the transactions, and in every transaction, give the letter of your choice. So for example, for number 10, you write first, withdrew 1,000 pesos for personal use. Then you indicate my answer is letter A or B or C. And then sa baba ng answer mo, i-illustrate mo yung answer mo. Sulat mo yung accounting equation, assets is equal to liabilities plus equity. And then pa-highlight. Kung meron kayong highlighter, pa-highlight ng category or categories na affected. If in case na walang highlighter, pwedeng i-encircle na lang ninyo. I-insert or i-enclose nyo yung category na affected, directly affected. And then you indicate an arrow figure. Okay? or yeah, an arrow figure. If there is an increase, then arrow up. Then there is a decrease, arrow down. And then paki-indicate sa arrow kung anong particular account yung affected. Example yun sa mga example natin kanina, if there is an increase in asset in the form of cash, then gawa ka ng arrow, uh, arrow up, then inside the arrow, you indicate cash. Okay, para ma-determine na cash pala yung nag-increase. So if you have questions or clarifications, feel free to message me through our Discord server or send me an email to my Gmail account. So that's all for this lecture. Good luck and God bless. Stay safe.